In tonight's episode of A House Divided, we consider how democracies die. That is the title of a 2018 book by two Harvard professors of government, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, who were less surprised than the rest of us about what happened on January 6th because they could feel it coming in their 2018 book when they wrote, "We feel dread, as do so many Americans, even as we try to reassure ourselves that things can't really be that bad here. This is how we tend to think of democracies dying, at the hands of men with guns. But there is another way to break a democracy. It is less dramatic, but equally destructive. Democracies may die at the hands not of generals, but of elected leaders, presidents, or prime ministers who subvert the very process that brought them to power." In an article last month, co-written by Professor Levitsky, we find the prediction that the United States is probably not headed for a civil war or headed for a functioning dictatorship. Quote, "Even if the Republicans manage to steal the 2024 election, their ability to monopolize power over an extended period of time will likely be limited. America may no longer be safe for democracy, but it remains inhospitable to autocracy. Rather than autocracy, the United States appears headed toward endemic regime instability." Joining us now are Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, both professors of government at Harvard University. Professor Levitsky, let me begin with you and the point you make about how the American system is resistant to autocracy. We've heard much about the weaknesses of our democracy and the cracks in it, but talk about why it's difficult to establish autocracy in the United States.
Well, I don't think it's the reasons that many people often think about it. I don't think it's our culture. I don't think that's our Constitution or our history. I think it's primarily the strength of opposition forces, strength of small d democratic forces. In most of the countries that we have watched where there's been severe democratic backsliding, countries like Hungary or Russia or Venezuela, opposition forces have been very weak. Opposition parties have been weak. Oppositions have been divided. The media is weak. Civil society is weak. In the U.S., the Democratic Party represents, for all of its flaws, represents a well-organized, well-financed, electorally viable opposition, and organized civil society is quite strong. So the ability of the Republicans or say a Trumpist government to just wipe out or stamp or trample on the opposition, I think, is pretty limited. The Democrats, small d Democrats, are going to continue to fight back.
Daniel Ziblatt, when you felt dread in 2018 in writing your book, I don't suppose you could envision something as specific as the January 6th attack, but how did you feel on January 6th watching that attack on the Capitol, given all that you'd written about the collapse of democracies?
You know, so that morning, Steve and I were texting, as we often do, and trying to assess how serious to take the threat when we saw the people gathering in D.C. And, you know, I have to say, probably like everybody, you feel kind of this lurch towards the unknown of what could happen. A little bit like the feeling of September 11th. But one of the things that, where I find solace or also kind of intellectual comprehension of what's happening is I think of other events that have happened in other places and other times that are very similar. So, you know, throughout history, there have been in other countries assaults on parliaments, sometimes generals and soldiers, sometimes the rabble, as we saw in the United States on January 6th. So in France in the 1930s, there was an attack on the parliament. In Spain in 1981, there was an attack on the parliament. Often these attacks fail, but one of the most important things that I thought about on that day was how does the establishment respond to this? How do mainstream parties respond to it? Because if we look throughout history, one of the major determinants of how a country rebounds from one of these kinds of events is there uniform condemnation across the political spectrum? In Spain in 1981, all the parties condemned it, from the far left to the far right. Spain has endured as a democracy ever since. France in the 1930s, there was a very split view, the right kind of treated the attack as a kind of heroic moment, and French democracy collapsed 6 years later. So I think the way that elites respond, the way parties respond, and what has made me worried since January 6th is the polarized response of the United States and the effort by majority elements within the Republican Party to create an alternative set of facts and an alternative narrative. And I think that is a very dangerous kind of precedent of what could come.
Professor Levitsky, one of the oddities of this new American discussion about losing our democracy is that we already had an electoral college, which is an anti-democratic institution, when we already had a United States Senate from the start based on 2 senators per state, no matter what the population of that state is. And that 2 senators per state construction has become increasingly perverse over time as California explodes in population and the Dakotas stay with a population smaller than most American big cities.
Yeah, the United States is one of the few democracies in the world that has retained many of its 18th and early 19th century institutions. One characteristic of other established democracies in the world, Canada, across Europe, is there's been a slow but steady dismantling of counter-majoritarian institutions. No other presidential democracy on earth has an electoral college anymore. Argentina was the last one to get rid of it, and that was in 1994. No other democracy outside of Brazil or Argentina has a Senate that is as malapportioned as the United States. These are pretty undemocratic institutions. So there are multiple ways in which our democracy is challenged. One is we're faced with an increasingly anti-democratic force that has taken over the Republican Party. But another one, even from that aside, is that we've got some pretty antiquated and pretty anti-democratic institutions.
And Professor Ziblatt, you have written that the current system allows for minority rule, in effect.
Yes, and so, I mean, the process that Steve described allows for a situation in which majorities vote for a president and you don't get the president that majorities vote for. So, you know, the Republicans have won the popular vote for the presidency only one time in this century, in 2004, and yet have governed for 12 of the last 20 years. And so what this means is that majorities don't always get their say. Now, understand, democracy is certainly more than majority rule. I'm a fan of the Bill of Rights, of judicial review, protection of minorities. But when you get such an accumulation of these institutions, you get to a moment where when majorities can't rule at all, you don't have a democracy. So you look at the Senate filibuster, you look at the Electoral College, and you see that these are real challenges to majority rule.